4,115. That is the number of children, verified by the Paris Police Prefecture's own records, who were arrested on July 16th and 17th, 1942, in the city of Paris. Not by German soldiers, not by the SS, not by the Gestapo. They were arrested by French police officers, wearing French uniforms, carrying French-issued identification, following orders signed by French officials, using lists compiled by French bureaucrats from census data that the French administration had voluntarily assembled 2 years earlier. The youngest were barely 2 years old. The oldest were not yet 16. And here is the detail that will stay with you long after this story ends. The Germans had not asked for them. The Nazis had not requested a single child. The decision to include 4,115 children in the largest mass arrest in French history was made in Paris, not in Berlin. This is the story of the Vélodrome Roundup, the day France betrayed its own children. To understand what happened on that July morning, you need to understand the system that made it possible. In June 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany in a catastrophic 6-week military collapse. An armistice was signed, and France was divided into 2 zones. The northern zone, occupied directly by German forces, and the so-called Zone Libre in the south, governed by a new regime based in the spa town of Vichy. This regime, led by the aging World War I hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, was not merely a puppet government tolerating German demands. It was, from its earliest days, an active collaborator. Within months of its establishment, the Vichy government passed its own anti-Jewish legislation, the Statut des Juifs of October 1940, without any German requirement to do so. French Jews were barred from public office, from the military, from teaching, from journalism, from cinema. And in the occupied zone, a separate but parallel process was underway: the mandatory registration of all Jewish residents at local police stations. French officials compiled the files. French clerks organized the data. French typists created the index cards. By the summer of 1942, the Prefecture of Police in Paris held a detailed registry of the Jewish population. Names, addresses, nationalities, ages, organized by arrondissement. These were the files that would become arrest lists. In May and June of 1942, 3 senior Nazi officials visited Paris: Reinhard Heydrich, head of the SS Security Service, Fritz Sauckel, organizer of forced labor, and Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer in charge of Jewish deportation logistics across Europe. Their visits signaled an escalation. The so-called final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jewry, was now to be applied to France. But here is where the French contribution becomes impossible to dismiss as mere obedience. On July 2, 1942, a planning meeting took place between René Bousquet, the 33-year-old Secretary General of the French National Police, and Karl Oberg, the senior SS commander in France. At that meeting, according to minutes discovered decades later by historian Serge Klarsfeld in German archives, Bousquet raised no objection to the mass arrest of Jews. His only concern, documented in those same minutes, was what he called the gênant, the embarrassing fact, that French police would be seen carrying out the operation. Bousquet's solution was not to refuse, it was to negotiate the terms. He proposed that the Roundup target only foreign and stateless Jews, thereby preserving the fiction that France was protecting its own citizens. The Vichy government ratified this agreement the following day. The operation was codenamed. In the planning documents of the Paris Prefecture, as part of a broader series of arrests across France during the spring and summer of 1942. The original date was set for July 13th or 14th, but Bousquet and Pierre Laval, the head of the Vichy government, intervened to delay it. The reason was not humanitarian. July 14th is Bastille Day, France's national holiday celebrating liberty, equality, and fraternity. The optics of arresting thousands of men, women and children on the day France celebrates freedom were, apparently, too inconvenient. The arrest was moved to July 16th. On July 12, 1942, Émile Hennequin, director of the Paris Municipal Police, issued his operational order. The document, preserved in the archives of the prefecture, is a masterwork of bureaucratic precision applied to human destruction. It specified the deployment of approximately 9,000 police officers and gendarmes. It assigned teams to each arrondissement. It detailed the procedures for entering homes, the treatment of the elderly and the sick, and the logistics of transport by city bus. And it contained one sentence that distills the entire operation into its bureaucratic essence. Hennequin ordered, and these are his documented words, that the operations must be carried out with maximum speed, without pointless speaking, and without comment. Without pointless speaking, without comment. 9,000 armed men knocking on doors at 4 in the morning, dragging families from their beds, and the operational instruction was, do not talk to them, do not explain, just take them. At 4 o'clock in the morning on July 16, 1942, the operation began. Across Paris, in every arrondissement, French police officers knocked on doors. They carried lists. They checked names against addresses. They gave families minutes, sometimes 15, sometimes 5, to pack a single bag. According to the prefecture records, by the end of July 17th, the police had arrested 152 people. The breakdown, meticulously recorded by the same bureaucracy that organized the arrests, was 3, 118 men, 5, 919 women, and 4, 115 children. Single adults and childless couples, approximately 6,000 people, were taken directly to the transit camp at Drancy, north of Paris. The rest, over 8,000 people, roughly half of them children, were taken to the Vélodrome d'hiver, an indoor cycling stadium in the 15th arrondissement near the Eiffel Tower. The Vélodrome was not designed for human habitation. It was a sports arena. Its glass ceiling had been painted blue and sealed to comply with wartime blackout regulations, which meant that in the July heat, the interior became a greenhouse. There was almost no water. There was almost no food. The few toilets were quickly overwhelmed and clogged. Sarah Lichtstein-Montard, who was 14 years old at the time and would later testify about her experience, described the scene in an interview recorded for French television. There were already thousands of people inside, she recalled. The noise was unbearable. Children were running in every direction. The adults in the stands were silent. And the smell was atrocious. The few toilets were instantly blocked. She saw adults relieving themselves wherever they could. For 5 days, over 8,000 people, mothers, fathers, grandparents, toddlers, infants, were held in this arena. The only outside assistance came from a handful of Red Cross workers and Quakers who managed to bring in limited supplies. A team of doctors and nurses, including several Jewish physicians, provided what medical care they could under impossible conditions. According to a study published in a French medical journal examining the role of these doctors, some of them managed to save children by fabricating diagnoses of infectious disease, a false medical record as an act of resistance. But these were exceptions. The system worked as designed. After 5 days, the detainees were transferred to transit camps outside Paris, Drancy, Pithiviers, and Beaune-la-Rolande. And it was at these camps that the operation revealed its cruelest dimension. The adults were separated from their children. This was not a chaotic accident. It was an administrative decision. The fathers were deported first, in sealed cattle cars, to Auschwitz. The official pretext was that they were being sent east to prepare housing for their families. Then the mothers were taken. French police physically separated screaming children from their mothers' arms. Survivor testimonies collected by the USC Shoah Foundation and preserved at Yale's Fortunoff Video Archive describe scenes that no dramatization could improve upon and no responsible narrator should attempt to embellish. The documents are sufficient. The mothers were deported to Auschwitz. They were gassed upon arrival. And then, and this is where the documented record becomes almost unbearable in its bureaucratic clarity, 115 children remained alone in French transit camps, guarded by French gendarmes. Some of these children were 2 years old, some were 3. They did not understand where their parents had gone. They did not understand what was happening, and they were held in these camps for weeks, in deteriorating conditions, until the logistics of deportation could accommodate them. When they were finally loaded onto trains to Auschwitz, they were placed in cattle cars among adult strangers. They arrived at Auschwitz, where they were murdered. With the exception of 6 adolescents, not a single one of those children survived. Now, let that settle for a moment, and then consider this. The decision to include those children was not German, it was French. The documentary evidence, assembled over decades by Serge Klaasfeld, himself the son of a father deported to Auschwitz from France, is unambiguous. Klaasfeld, working through the archives of both the German occupation authorities and the French administration, uncovered the telegrams, the meeting minutes, the internal memoranda that trace the chain of decision. The original German request, coordinated by SS officer Theodor Dannecker, specified the deportation of adult Jews. The age threshold was set at 16, a deliberate fiction designed to support the cover story that deportees were being sent for labor. Children under 16 were not part of the German plan. It was Pierre Laval, the head of the Vichy government, who proposed including the children. His stated rationale, preserved in the documented record, was humanitarian, a word that, in this context, functions as an obscenity. Laval argued that deporting parents without their children would be cruel, that families should be kept together. This was the official justification. But as Klaasfeld's research demonstrated, and as the timeline of deportations confirms, the parents and children were not kept together. They were separated. The parents were deported first. The children were deported weeks later, alone. Laval's humanitarian measure produced the exact opposite of what it claimed. Children torn from their parents, held for weeks in camps without any family member, and then sent to their deaths among strangers. And Bousquet's role went further still. Klaasfeld discovered telegrams sent by Bousquet to the prefects of departments in the occupied zone, telegrams that ordered the deportation not only of Jewish adults, but of children whose deportation had not even been requested by the Nazis. Bousquet personally cancelled the exemptions that had protected children under 18 and parents with children under 5. He did not merely comply with German demands, he expanded them. He extended them to categories the Germans themselves had not targeted. This is not interpretation. This is not inference. These are signed documents, preserved in archives, presented as evidence in legal proceedings, and corroborated by the testimony of 3 former SS officers who stated, in depositions given in 1980, that Vichy officials had been enthusiastic about the deportation of Jews from France. The Roundup of July 16th and 17 accounted for more than a quarter of the 42,000 Jews deported from France to Auschwitz in 1942. Of those 42,000, only 811 returned alive at the end of the war. In total, approximately 77,000 Jews who had been living in France, citizens and refugees alike, were deported during the occupation. Roughly a quarter of France's pre-war Jewish population was destroyed, but the Vélodrome was not the end of the story. It was, in many ways, only the beginning of a longer betrayal, the betrayal of memory. After the liberation of Paris in August 1944, France constructed a national narrative of resistance. The myth was that France, as a nation, had resisted the German occupation, that Vichy was an aberration, an illegitimate parenthesis in French history, and that the true France was embodied by Charles de Gaulle and the Free French forces. This narrative was politically convenient. It allowed France to rebuild its national identity without confronting the extent of its collaboration. And it was sustained with remarkable tenacity for over 50 years. René Bousquet, the man who organized the Vélodrome Roundup, who personally cancelled the exemptions for children, who sent the telegrams ordering their deportation. René Bousquet was tried in 1949 by the Haute Cour de Justice. The trial lasted 3 days. According to the judicial record, only about 1 to 2 hours were devoted to his role in deporting Jews. He was acquitted of the primary charge and given a sentence of 5 years of national indignity, a penalty that was immediately suspended because the court accepted his claim that he had also participated in acts of resistance. Bousquet walked free. He entered the private sector, became a successful businessman, and by the 1970s had re-entered French political life. In 1974, he helped finance the presidential campaign of François Mitterrand. According to multiple sources, including reporting by journalists and researchers who investigated Mitterrand's wartime and post-war connections, Bousquet was a regular visitor to the Élysée Palace throughout the 1980s, during Mitterrand's presidency. The man who signed the telegrams ordering the deportation of Jewish children was dining with the President of France. It was not until 1989 that Serge Klarsfeld and the Association of Sons and Daughters of Jewish Deportees from France filed formal complaints against Bousquet for crimes against humanity, specifically for the deportation of children. The French judicial system moved with extraordinary reluctance. The initial case was sent to a court that no longer existed. Lawyers for the International Federation of Human Rights described it, in public statements, as a political decision at the highest levels to prevent the Bousquet affair from developing. Bousquet was finally indicted in 1991, charged with crimes against humanity for the deportation of 2,000 children. His trial was scheduled for 1993. He never stood trial. On June 8, 1993, René Bousquet was shot dead at his home by a mentally unstable man named Christian Didier. He was 82 years old. The trial that might have forced France to confront, in a court of law, the full extent of its collaboration died with him. It is worth noting that Bousquet's death was convenient for a great many people, politically, institutionally, and personally. Whether it was anything more than the act of a disturbed individual remains, as the French say, an open question. The Vélodrome d'Hiver itself, the building where 8,000 people, half of them children, were held for 5 days in July heat without water, without food, without sanitation, was demolished in 1959. For decades, there was no memorial at the site. The physical evidence of what had happened was erased, and with it, a convenient erasure of memory. It was not until July 16, 1995, 53 years after the Roundup, that a French president acknowledged what had happened. Jacques Chirac, standing at the memorial that had finally been erected, spoke words that broke 5 decades of official silence. France, he said, land of the Enlightenment and of human rights, land of hospitality and asylum. France, on that day, committed the irreparable. It failed to keep its word and delivered those under its protection to their executioners. Chirac named what his predecessors had refused to name. It was the French state that organized this. It was the French police who carried it out. The criminal madness of the occupiers was aided by the French state. Those words were necessary, but they came 53 years too late for Paulette Zajac, who was 5 years old when she was arrested by French police, held at Pithiviers, and deported on Convoy 20 to Auschwitz on August 17, 1942. They came too late for Marcel, whose mother and sisters were deported to Auschwitz and killed, and whose father was arrested 2 years later and sent to the same death. They came too late for the thousands of children whose names Serge Klarsfeld spent decades recovering, assembling one by one, their photographs, their addresses, their ages, the convoys that carried them east, the dates they were murdered, and publishing them in his memorial volume so that each child would exist as a person, not a statistic. Klarsfeld described that work in terms that belong in the historical record. "This is not a book of death," he said. "It is a book of life. It is as if the children photographed were testifying at the witness stand about the crimes committed against them." And here is perhaps the most devastating detail in a story already saturated with devastating details. When Klarsfeld examined the full scope of the deportation of children from France, he arrived at a conclusion that complicates the narrative in a way that France has never fully absorbed. Approximately 75% of the Jewish children arrested during the roundups of 1942 were arrested by French police, not by German forces. The French state did not merely assist, it led. And yet, paradoxically, France as a nation saved a higher proportion of its Jewish population than almost any other occupied country in Western Europe. 3/4 of France's Jews survived the war, many hidden by French citizens, by Catholic families, by networks of resistance that operated in direct opposition to the state. The heroism was real, but so was the betrayal. And the betrayal was institutional, systematic, documented and signed. The Vélodrome roundup remains the largest mass arrest in wartime French history. It was planned in French offices, executed by French police, and facilitated by French bureaucracy. The children who were taken had committed no crime. They held no foreign allegiance. Many of them had been born in France. They were French children, by any definition that matters, and they were handed to their executioners by the country that was supposed to protect them. Émile Hennequin's operational order of July 12, 1942, instructed 9,000 police officers to carry out the arrests with maximum speed, without pointless speaking and without comment. 84 years later, the comment that France avoided for half a century has finally been spoken. But the 4,115 children who were taken from their beds at 4 in the morning by men in French uniforms, those children never heard it. They were sent to Auschwitz in sealed trains, and none of them, not one with the exception of 6 adolescents, ever came back. The youngest were 2 years old. The Germans had not asked for them. France gave them anyway.